Greetings. My name is Ben Gorman and I'm the co-editor of Asian Ethnology. Welcome to Asian Ethnology Podcast. In this episode, I'm talking with Erica Baffelli, Senior Lecturer of Japanese Studies at the University of Manchester. Erica's areas of research include religion in contemporary Japan, new religions, religion and media, religion and the internet, religion, women and violence, as well as Japanese studies. Erica, welcome to Asian Ethnology Podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Let's start by asking you about your initial interest in studying Japanese society. Why did you decide to do that?
I started with studying Japanese language. So I enrolled at the University Ca' Foscari in Venice and in Japanese language and literature. But then when we were in year 3, we had to choose specialization. And I picked Japanese religion and philosophies, as it was called, that included also taking courses in India, religion and philosophy in China, and then Japan, and also some modules on anthropology. I didn't know much about Japan. I must confess, I didn't know much. I didn't have particular interest in Japan. So it was quite a random choice you made when you were 18.
Okay. How many languages are you familiar with?
I studied French when it was a junior high, and then English, and then Japanese, and Italian is my first language.
Okay, so Japanese was like to study an Asian language was very different from what you had looked at before.
Exactly. I think the other reason was also I really liked philosophy when I was in high school, and the idea of expanding beyond the Western philosophy that we were studying was also one other thing that attracted me to Japanese studies and cultural, so East Asian studies program at the time. Because the only way to study something that was outside the Western philosophy of history was to enroll in an East Asian studies program.
Okay.
So that was one of the other reasons.
Okay.
But I also liked math and physics at the time, so I didn't really have a very clear idea what to do.
Okay.
But then Venice as a city was also quite attractive, so that was one of the other reasons I went.
Why did you start studying new religions of Japan?
That was also quite by chance at the beginning. In the second year in Venice, I applied for the Erasmus studentship to study in another European university for one year. And my first choice was Paris. So I went to Paris for 1 year. And I was, during my year in Paris, I attended some classes by Jean-Pierre Berton, who was an expert on Japanese new religion, and the class was on Japanese new religion, and is how my interest started. I had already took one module on Japanese religion in Venice that I found really fascinating, and then I was very interested to see how people in contemporary Japan were practicing religion. So I found Professor Berton classes very, very interesting. And that is when I decided that I wanted to focus on new religion for my BA/MA dissertation in Venice. The reason of my choices were a combination of randomness and also the people I met, the professors, because there was both my professor in Venice, Massimo Raveri, and Berton in France, that was highly influential on me deciding to wanting to study Japanese religion.
Was that Japanese religion in general, or was it new religions in particular?
New religion in particular.
Okay.
So I'm always been more interested, quite curious about people, so why people do things. So I always been quite interested to talk to people and see why they were practicing religion, why they were doing religion in contemporary Japan. So I immediately was much more interested in looking at what's going on now, more than textual approach on pre-modern religion, because I like this idea of interacting and also seeing what was going on in the contemporary society. So I think my interest moved quite quickly towards the new religion.
Right.
And then there was the media aspect as well. I was quite interested at the time to look at media, because there was, again, another class I was taking that was on media and society and religion that was quite interested. But also it was the late 90s. 97, 98 when I was in Paris. And then I came back, and it was when internet was spreading around.
Right.
And at the time, so there was a combination of two factors. One, there was internet that was starting getting attention, and some of the early work about internet and religion was starting appearing. But also, I didn't have funding to come to Japan to collect primary sources. So studying magazine would have been much more complicated at the time, or newspaper, because we still didn't have the database that you now have access online. So I thought studying internet would have been useful because I could access the primary sources without having to spend a long period in Japan. So that is why I started with looking at internet and religion at the time. So there was a combination of two elements. And then, of course, when I then finished my first degree and entered the postgraduate, I could come and spend more time in Japan and started doing more interviews as well. Right. For my first small dissertation, I was mainly interviewing webmaster via email. So I started doing this online kind of interview at the very beginning, because it was the easier way to talk with them and access the material.
Do you find that there was a difference? Obviously, there's a difference when you actually meet people and when you converse with them online. The people who you initially connected with via email, did you end up going to interview them in person?
I met some of them later on, some of the webmaster, because some of the group I initially interviewed that I wanted to learn a little bit more about their use of the media, not just the internet. So I went back and contacted them later. And of course, it was then the conversation was not just about the internet, but about the use of other media as well. So it's expanded. At the time, I think it was mainly email. There was no social network yet. And there was a very slow email. But I think it was still very useful to start a discussion, a conversation, and now and then have a face-to-face discussion. I sometimes found easier than reverse. So having first a face-to-face interview and then continue the discussion via email when you already have established a face-to-face connection with an informant is tend to be quite useful. And I do it quite often with people I interview. And then when I re-looking at the field notes, I might have questions. So we continue the discussion via email.
What groups have you concentrated on?
Agonshu is a Buddhist organization that was founded in late 70s, but was also previously founded in the 50s. And the leader is called Kiriyama Seiyu and passed away in 2016 when he was 95. It's an esoteric Buddhist organization. They performed this big event in February that is known as the Star Festival, where there is this very big fire. There are one devoted to the spirit of the deceased, and the other one is for your wishes. So this is the main event. And a lot of the teaching of the organization is about pacifying the spirits in order to which are causing all this illness and misfortune. So there is the idea of cutting the karma as one of the central idea in the organization. So getting rid to all these kind of hindrances caused by unhappy spirits. Kofuku no Kagako is an organization founded in 1986 by Okawa Ryuho. At the time was very young, was in his 30s. They've been changing teaching and adding different type of teaching over the years, but one of the main idea in the organization is this creation of utopia, or utopia and earth. So this kind of ideal world, which is based on the principle of happiness, taught in the organization. And there is this idea of multi-layer universe, a cosmology is multi-layer, where in each of these dimensions there are several spirits living in it. And the leader, who is since 1991 too, considered Buddha, so the rebirth of Buddha. He's also able to have these spiritual messages from initially were from people who deceased people, but more recently he can also have these spiritual messages with spirits, protective spirits of people that are still alive. And they span from religious figures to Donald Trump, Putin, etc. So they told to him in Japanese, and then this is usually published in a book, or there are now also public performance of this Reagan, and they give indication about current social issue, politics. So the group also has a political party, the Happiness Realization Party, founded in 2008, and also some schools. So this idea of that the idea of utopia encompasses not just religious spheres, but also all secular spheres like education and politics and economics. So this is their view. The final organization, Om Shinrikyo, was also founded around the same period in mid-80s, 84, as a yoga group initially, and then became more and more an apocalyptic group, talking more and more about the end of the world and the proximity of the end of the world with the coming of 1999. And the other, the leader, Asahara Shoko, was one of the characteristics of the organization was the part of the members, not all of them lived in commune around Japan, so they were renounced, they were shukke, they were giving up everything and entering the commune and living together with the other member. The group is notorious for the 1995 sarin gas attack that was perpetrated by some of the members and several other crimes they committed before it, including killing of some other members or people that they thought they were against them. The group is now being officially dismantled in 1999, but there are now two splinter organizations, Aleph since 2000 and Hikari no Wa since 2008. Has been funded by, Hikari no Wa is it's funded by some ex-member, while Aleph is in a sense the continuation of Om. Okay. Some of the members that stay in the organization. And Hikari no Wa has been quite vocally detaching themselves, wanted to be recognized as a different organization. Aleph doesn't really make many public declaration in general. So they've been quite cautious in talking with the media in particular.
How did you get in touch with these people in the first place, at least the ex-Om members?
It's usually a combination of different ways. Some of them, I contacted them, I started getting in contact a few years ago when I was working on internet again. Yeah. After a few years, I went back to look at the internet when the social networks were expanding, and I just sent an email and asked if I could go and meet and talk with them, and they reply and say yes. So I initially interviewed the PR representative of the organization, but then I started attending some of their training sessions, some of the other events, and so my network started expanding, and then from there I started interviewing some of the other members. Tracing ex-member outside the established organization is quite difficult, simply because you don't know where they are. So I've been contacting some of them through the social networking. I find, or I've been told about some blog that were written by ex-member, and I contacted them through the blog. In other cases, are people that I knew before and I knew they have left. So some of them contacted me and say, we left the organization. So I'm interviewing them. Sometimes it's been through people I knew that put me in contact with some ex-members. So it's been a combination. What I was, and I'm still trying to be very careful, is not to interview only people on the same circle, because then it's, of course, limited and raise some issues. So I try to use different way to reach out these people if and ask if they are interested to talk. So it's also a slow process, I might say. I'm not having collected 100 of interviews because every time is a kind of time consuming, but I'm quite keen on trying to reach a very diverse group of people that has been member for different length. Or they joined in different period and they also left in different periods. So I so far interview people that enter in 86, 87, so the very beginning. Other who enter in 92, 93, very close to the sarin gas attack period. Right. Some of the member I interview left immediately after the sarin gas attack, and some I interview left 3-4 years ago. So the experience are very different, and I'm quite keen on try to have the more variety of voices I could. But of course, it's not an easy task. Because they are not necessarily part of a specific organization or network, and some of them, for very obvious reason, don't want to be found.
Do you go in, when you interview the people, do you go in with a specific set of questions, or do you just let them talk about their experience? Like, for example, would some people want to talk about their views of the media and or something like that?
They usually, of course, they often ask me what I want to talk about. Yes. And in that case, I might send them some of the idea, some of the topics I would like, but also say it doesn't necessarily need to cover that, and also if any of this topic make you uncomfortable, we can just simply not talk about that. But then usually the interviews start with them telling their stories. So I don't ask any question. I just ask, can you just tell me your story? And in that case, some people might start from their childhood, and some they might start from the moment they join the organization. So it's very different. So I have interviewed that lasted 5-6 hours, so very long interview. And then also I ask questions during the interview, but I tend to let them also select the topic they want to talk. Because what I'm also interested in is memory. What's happening in that experience is memorialized. So what are the elements that ex-members think is important in constructing their narrative about their experience? So I try as much as I can not to guide it too much, but to let them talk about their experience. My questions tend to be questions about clarification on aspects I might don't have understood, or when there are mention of teaching, I might ask to clarify some of the teaching they are talking about. Or then if a topic came up that I'm particularly interested about, I might ask if we can talk a little bit more about that. But I tend not to have a set list of questions.
Yeah. Do you see themes in what they present?
Yes. Yeah. My recent interview has been mainly focusing on female ex-members. So I've been talking with a lot of women. And the topic that I'm now looking through some of the preliminary interviews are looking about issue related to ascetic practices and discussion about body and how the body is described and how those practices are described, and an issue about training, how was performed, and a lot of discussion about relationship and community and how that was organizing the organization, but also often a discussion about how the external world would see them. So portraying media, and also how the media narratives have influenced some of the narrative of the ex-member. It's a very interesting topic that's coming up. So some of the narrative are in response to those portray, to try to rectify or some, this is not really what happened, or in some case say, that is true, that it was. So there is usually quite a lot of discussion about some specific either documentary, TV representation or some magazine representation that they want to respond to and say, well, this is not really what happened, or this is quite accurate as a representation. So this is another theme that is actually, so the public discourse about the organization is one of the themes. But also another important theme is what happened afterwards. So how the separation happened from the organization and what was the challenges or not. And how they dealt with it, but also how they see now their previous experience. So how they now interpret or conceptualize being in that organization for that time. And then there is usually discussion about violence, definition of violence, or violence act, which is often one of the themes that, of course, for obvious reason, is touched when discussing so these are the emerging themes that I'm starting looking at, but it's still very, I would stress, very preliminary in the sense that I still have to. And then what I tend to do is after the interview is to write the transcripts and send it back.
Okay.
And there's been a case recently that one of the person I interviewed sent me back the response with addition and say, there are a few points that I think I need to clarify a little bit more. And there were 3 or 4 points she wanted just to add a little bit more explanation.
We had an experience a few years ago where we went to the Nagoya. It was a facility of the Kofuku no Kagaku. This is a very interesting group to me. What has been your experience working with the group, and particularly from the perspective of media representation and also, I guess, members' self-perceptions?
At the beginning, when I started contacted them at the beginning, they never replied to my email. So I decided to just go to one of the center. And I entered the center and I just explained who I was and why I was there. I'm a PhD student. I'm working on new religion and media. At the time, I still wasn't completely sure that that would have been the main focus. I was interviewing several organizations. So I would like to ask you a question. And I think was, again, I think that luck is a big part of fieldwork experience. And there was a young female member there that was extremely welcome. And we started talking, and then she started introducing me to some of the people. And some of the people I knew in that first year then went up in the organizations, keep working in the organization. So they became, over the year, I could see they're having children and going back to work and then moving to another department. But I will try usually to contact them and then asking if I could go and attend some or visit some of the center. I noticed that compared to the beginning when I started in the following year, that it was a little bit more openness towards researcher or giving access. At the same time, I think it's always important to keep in mind that you might have you might not have access to everything you want to. There might be part of the organization or the practice that are preclude to you.
Yeah.
In my study with them, the idea was mainly to look at how media were used in the very beginning of the organization. So it was the 80s of the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and how then the tension with the Kodansha at the time was dealt in the organization. So I was not going to do many interview with the members. So I interviewed people working at the magazine, in the publishing house, but I attended quite a lot of events, so I ended up really talking with a lot of members. And I think that there is usually a lot of suspicious towards journalists and media in most of these organizations. A bit of distrust of academics as well, but at the end, I don't think they seen us as problematic at the media in a sense. And one time I was told, well, even if you write critically about us, at the end you at least came and told to us and collected the material. And I think that most of these organizations are also aware that our publication won't reach millions of people.
Right. Yeah.
Probably less problematic than a magazine attacking the leader, in a sense. So I think some of those organizations now understand that
academics' role is
different. But there is always this tension that I'm sure you are very aware as well, or distrust of academics, but also not wanted to become the academic voice of the organization. And is a really subtle line that you always have to balance. And at the end of the day, the fieldwork is an encounter. So you are asking these people you're meeting to, share a lot with you, and also a lot of very private things with you. And I also think it needs to be an exchange in a sense. So sometimes the exchange can be, they want you to talk about your thing as well. So you need to be, there is the kind of negotiation in a sense, but is an encounter. I don't really think you can just go and ask them to share everything, and sometimes very also traumatic discussion with you without offering anything. But it's a really fine line that the negotiation is. It's not always easy. Personally, I found it emotionally quite difficult sometimes.
Yeah, it can be tough. I mean, I don't know. I've been asked to join a number of different groups at different times. When I ask them questions, they start to see me as a potential member. Does that happen to you?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
With Kofu no Kagaku. Okay. Yes. It doesn't happen with Exxon members because I don't think they are quite aware that I won't join. The ex-member, some of them are not part of the organization, but even the one they are part of the organization, I think they're quite realistic about no possibility for me to join, but it's happened with other organizations.
Okay.
And when saying no means being, accept that your access can be limited. Or you won't be allowed to do some of the practice or activity, but then it's something it's a choice and it needs to be taken into consideration.
So I've got in my hand your book, Media and New Religions in Japan. You're covering some of the groups that you've mentioned, Agonshu, Kofu no Kagaku, Om Shinrikyo, Hikari no Wa. Do you think these new religious groups grasp onto the importance of media, or do they try and reject it to a certain extent, or how do they try and see the media outside themselves?
I think it's a constant tension.
Right.
There is always the understanding of the importance of the media, or the mainstream media, to be out, to have their voice heard, but at the same time, this distrust of media as not being able to represent them correctly or to only focusing on scandals. I think some of them have seen social networking as in particular, Hikari no Wa, as their way to be able to reach out without the mediation of mainstream media, because they can have their YouTube channel, they can have their blog and Twitter. And I think that was very useful at the beginning of the organization to make clear their statement that they were detaching from Aleph and setting something new and different. Some other organization like Agonsu, I would say, are a bit struggling with the new media. So they are set up a very beautiful new website a few years ago, but is very rarely updates. Last year, there was no mention of the death of the leader for months in the website. And even they have a Facebook page and a Twitter page, but they are mainly list of quotes from publication or some announcement or some event, but so I think the interactive part of social media is not really developed. And this might be due to the fact that there might be nobody in the organization that is interested or able to do it. And most of the interaction between members is still done by going to the events and collecting the pamphlet there and then getting the information in that way, or receiving the publication from the organization at home. So this is still their main mean of communication. And they rarely appear in other media except during the main festival in February, where usually local TV have a small program about them, and there are usually one or two paid ad appearing in newspaper about the event. But I think this year, at the end of the year, one of the Kyoto local station was also they had a small program about the end of the year event in their main center, but they don't really appear that much. So I think there's an ongoing tension with between the religion organization in general, probably, but even more with New Religion, because as usual, I would say the older New Religion, if you can call them like that, now they are established in a way that is really similar to traditional Buddhist organizations. So it's a family affiliation, it's several generations down. So I think the push for proselytism is probably less intense than some of the other group. So they are they use their own media, but they don't put maybe that much effort to appear on the mainstream media. For some of the other group, the more recent one, there is always this tension of mistrusting the media, saying the media is something that will just criticize them and attack them, but at the same time wanting to be visible. So the visibility issue is still, I think, there.
With your research on Japan, is there stuff that you've learned from Japan and the Japanese experience and your work with new religions and media that you see correlations in other areas of research?
Definitely, and I think that I've seen even more and more recently that it will be interesting to have a little bit more comparative research or research group that look from different angles. One that is keep coming up recently is, I think that it will be very interesting to have a little bit more work together with scholar working in Asian, Southeast Asian, and all. For example, when we look about contemporary Buddhist organization in Taiwan, or some organization in Korea, some Buddhist organization in Southeast Asia, I think that would be very interesting to have a much more dialogue between scholars. Something that I cannot do because of the lack of language expertise to access those material. But there are people out there doing very interesting research on those areas, and I think that could be some very interesting comparative looking at, of course, different historical development and different contexts, but at the same time, similarity in some theme that they are appearing. I think that will be an area that I think will be very, very interesting to have more about. With women and violence, I've been working quite a lot with a colleague, anthropologist colleague in Copenhagen who work in India. And we have been discussing quite a lot a project looking of women participation in organizations that commit violence or violent acts and their experience. And so then I think in that area as well, there is a lot that hasn't been done, especially when we look outside some of the contexts like Islam. But in some other contexts, there is still quite a lot that could be done. And I think there is a lot of things that the Japanese case studies could contribute to general understanding those dynamics. More recently, one of my very recent work on Agonshu looks is a book manuscript that I just completed with Ian Reader. It looks at the life of a new religion in the first generation. So from the foundation to the death of the leader. So it's the first generation. And it all started because we realized that we had field notes on that group spanning from the 80s when Ian did fieldwork in Japan to now. Because I picked up fieldwork on Agonshu from the 2000s. So we had 35 years of material that we can look at and see how this organization did in their first generation. So we are using them as a case studies, but I think what the dynamics we look at can be applied in other contexts and with other case studies. So it doesn't want to be a book on Agonshu, but it's more the life cycle of a new religion in their first generation. And the fact that within they sometimes can get old quite quickly, even in a span of only 35, 40 years. So what are these dynamics of this changing? And of course, the impact of the death of the leader on the organization is something all religion organization has to deal or has dealt in their history. So this can also rely, and we look at cases in other contexts as well. In the final part of the book, we discuss about divinization of the leader. We look at some Chinese case in particular. So I think that again, the idea is to have a Japanese organization as a case studies, but the dynamics can be translated into different contexts, or at least used to create a dialogue with different contexts as well.
And what are you working on now?
So that my last few months were devoted to that book on Agonshu, but now I want to go back and on the project on the women and religion and violence, and look a little bit. I start working on this material, and the idea is to look at both a representation of women, both in the media, because they tended to be portrayed either like the beautiful, evil, young girl that were attractive and entered that organization, or as the neglected mother or the problematic daughter. But also there's also I'm quite interested in look on how they were portrayed in the publication by the organization, because some of them were profiled quite a lot early on in the magazine, and some of them published some books in so I want to look at those narratives as well, because again, they are creating a specific ideal of a female member, and then listening to the voices that of course create a much more complex picture. And also some of those voices respond to that representation. And this is something also I would like to look at. So there is quite a lot of work to do on that. One of the other problem, in a sense, that most of the publication by ex-members are from male members. So a lot of the discourse about ARM has been from a male member's perspective. So except for one ex-member recent book and 2 books from Azahara's daughters, all the books by members are from male members that tend to be some of the one they are currently in the death row. So we have much less about the women voices in the organization. So, and then, I think it's an interesting aspect as well. But it's still quite an ongoing project. And then I really just started a new project that look at healing practices across Asia. So this also would like to be a more comparative. So looking at, and so I'm working with currently a colleague working on India and another working on Okinawa and Taiwan. And we would like to look at both more historical approach, but my aspect will be more on the healing narrative. So how discussion about body and health are constructive and some of this groups narrative and conversion stories. It's still something we are thinking about, but this is as the idea, and it would be very interesting to bring in people from different contexts, but also from different disciplines. Looking at it, this is the idea, but it's still something that is just started.
Sounds great. Erica Baffelli, thank you very much for your time. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Asian Ethnology Podcast. You can access Asian Ethnology's website at asianethnology.org.